Good afternoon, everybody who's joining us this afternoon for NAHT's webinar, Race Equality in Education, Why There is Still So Much Work to be Done. Thank you to all of you members and non-members who've joined us this afternoon, particularly as the sun may well be shining where you are. So thank you for taking the time out to join us for this session. My name is Natalie Pettifer. I'm a regional organiser with NAHT and I'm facilitating this evening's event. You may see that on your screen you've got access to a chat section. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in there and to put any comments during the session as you wish. My colleague Alice will be on hand to help you if you're having any technical difficulties. So if that's the case, please make sure you just enter them into the chat section there. Throughout the session, we'll have a couple of opportunities for your questions to the panel. So you'll see you have a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Please do enter questions in there as opposed to the chat. And you have the opportunity then to vote for your favourite questions. And when we come to that part of the session, I'll take the most popular questions. So this session obviously comes over a year after the death of George Floyd, and the increased awareness of race inequality that has come about is something which we need to secure and to work towards improving race equality in society as a whole, but particularly as well today talking about within education. I'm joined by Tim Bowen, who is NAHT's National President, Kudsi Batul, who is the Head of Equalities and Strategy at the TUC, Emma Knights, Chief Executive of the NGA, National Governance Association, Sue Schofield, the Education Team Manager at Show Racism the Red Card. We've also got 3 members of NAHT's Leaders for Race Equality Network with us, Sabrina Edwards, Diana Ohini-Darko and Lorna Legg. Later on, we're going to be joined by our General Secretary, Paul Whiteman, and also Patrick Roach, Dr. Patrick Roach, who is the Chair of the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force. We have a BSL interpreter with us this evening, as you can see. So welcome, Sarah, thank you. A large panel, very much looking forward to hearing from all of them on how we can improve the situation within education in terms of race equality, work towards that, and taking your questions as well. So, before we move on to hearing first of all from Tim, I just want to say, please do feel free to share on Twitter that you're taking part in this webinar. The handle is @NAHT News. And if you want to include photographs, please make sure that you don't include names from the chat and from the Q&A of people who are taking part that way, just for privacy reasons. Thank you very much. So I'm going to now hand over to Tim.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. As Natalie said, I recently took over as the National President of NAHT, a tremendous honour to have that role. But I'm first and foremost a serving head teacher. I'm in my 25th year as a head teacher and currently on secondment from the headship of Maple School in St Albans. Can I first of all thank you all for joining this afternoon? I see on the screen we've got 125 participants. Many of you will have had a busy and a demanding day. So I think the fact that so many of you are attending this webinar shows the importance of the subject matter, and we are delighted that you've made time to join us this afternoon. When we set up this webinar, our main aim was that for those attending, you will leave with a clearer idea of how you will improve your settings approach to anti-racism and addressing race inequality over the coming year, or how to start planning for this. And I really hope by the end of the session in an hour's time that aim will have been met and you'll be well equipped going forward. I'm very much looking forward to listening to, learning from and reflecting with our various speakers, and including those who are members, leaders for the race equality movement in NAHT. So thank them also for their time. So I now look forward to sitting back and being challenged and to being inspired to hopefully become a better teacher and to move forward in this really important area that we're considering. So welcome again, everybody. It's great that you're here. Natalie, back to you.
Thank you, Tim. Just to add as well, before we move on, you were put a bit on the spot there because you're expecting to close this. I forgot to mention that Paul and Patrick are actually running late. They're in a meeting currently with the Permanent Secretary at the DfE. looking at the data around the different variants. So yeah, that's an interesting one there, which they obviously will join us as soon as they can. So thank you, Tim. We're now going to move on to hear from Kutsia from the TUC, and she's going to be talking about the workforce perspective in terms of equality.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks, Tim. Now, I am so proud to be here as a former NAHT member, as a former BME head teacher. To know that race equality is on the agenda means so much to me. And my colleagues will laugh because I still describe myself as a teacher, even though I haven't been a teacher for a number of years, because it is so fundamentally important to who I am. And being asked to do this today was really, significant. And one of the things I wanted to just get across is sometimes those of us that work in schools forget that actually we work in workplaces and we are employees, and we have rights and we have responsibilities, and schools can feel all-encompassing because they are, but we're not immune to what's happening in the world of work just because we're in schools. And I found that really interesting the minute I stepped out of the school context into a broader context, thinking, why is nobody telling teachers this? Why is nobody telling head teachers this? And I think, the more information we have and the more that we understand the broader context, the better informed we are. And I do apologise that I am going to start with the statistics around what the context is for BME people working in Britain today, because I think it's incredibly important. So, and it is quite a stark picture. So, we did a huge survey recently and we got a huge number of responses very quickly asking about what is it like for you at work. And, we know that more than a third of BME workers are being bullied, abused and experiencing racial discrimination by their employer. We know 20% of BME workers are experiencing discrimination in the forms of being denied training, being denied promotion. We know that a significant number of BME workers are experiencing verbal abuse, are experiencing verbal harassment from clients, customers, students. And 5% of those are experiencing physical violence or assault. And we know that a significant number of BME working people are telling us that the discrimination that they're experiencing was based upon their race, was based upon their ethnicity, and also on their gender. We know that the experiences of Black women are always poll the worst in terms of what we find out, and the intersection of being a woman and being a minority can lead to some awful experiences. But whilst those are known knowns, and we know that it can be difficult out there, what worried us and upset us significantly was the fact that 50% of BME working people did not feel able to report their experiences of discrimination, did not feel confident that when those incidents were reported, when those experiences were shared, that they would be dealt with satisfactorily, or that they wouldn't be then subject to further victimization or abuse or marginalization. And the reason for this is because the statistics we have around people that then leave their profession after raising incidents, after escalating things, after whistleblowing is about 30%. So 30% of BME working people are telling us that once they've escalated something, they've had to leave because the environment has become so hostile. And that paints a really stark picture of what it's like for BME working people today. And that's not even talking about other things like casualisation, the impact of poor working conditions, the impact of not being able to access PPE or safe working practices or flexible working, which we know for BME working people are worse than they are for other working people. But there are real decisive steps and action that can be taken to address this, and we implore that employers and government do those. And they are things like strong equality, diversity and dignity policies that explicitly include a zero tolerance approach to racism. We would like explicit statements saying, when staff are telling us that they are suffering racist abuse, that they have been subject to racist abuse, that they will be protected and they won't suffer as a result of whistleblowing. We need employers and government to publish data on BME pay, on BME recruitment, on promotion and dismissal rates, and then to set targets against those so we can see what action needs to be taken and what progress has been made. Most importantly, we need employers, we need governors, we need everybody to sit down with the trade union movement to establish those targets and to develop positive action together, because that's when the real change is occurring. That's when the listening happens. It's using the collective bargaining mechanism. And we need to make sure that there are simple methods for BME working people to report racism, and that the reports that they make are going to be treated with confidence, and that those BME working people are going to feel confident that they're going to be addressed satisfactorily, because currently that is just not happening. And I'm going to leave with the statement that everybody who raises a concern must feel they're listened to, must be taken seriously, and must not be victimized for doing so, because for too long, BME working people, BME teachers aren't exempt from this, aren't listened to, aren't taken seriously, you know, and that racism you're experiencing is banter. It's just colleagues having fun. And it's that real understanding of, when we're telling you what is happening, you need to listen and you need to take action on that. I'm going to finish there, Natalie, otherwise I can talk for 3 hours if you'd like me to.
Thank you. I'm sure what you'd have to say for 3 hours would be very interesting, but we do have lots of people who are looking forward to hearing from as well this evening. So thank you very much for that, Kudsia. I can see on my screen, as I'm sure you all can, that we've been joined now by Patrick Roach. I know that Paul Whiteman is also on his way in, so thank you very much. We know you were overrunning in a meeting earlier. So if you're ready, Patrick, if you'd like to take over and say what you have to say as chair of the TUC Anti-Racism Task Force.
Well, thanks very much, Natalie. The invitation to take over, it's just too tempting indeed, but maybe I'll say a few words is probably how I'll put it, but I appreciate that, and apologies for the late arrival. It is really very much a pleasure to be addressing this event this evening on what's an extremely important topic. And of course, I've been handed a responsibility on behalf of the TUC and the trade union movement, which of course the NAHT is a part, as is the NASWT, to advance the work of the movement as a whole in relation to the issues of racial justice and anti-racism. And of course, that work comes at a time when there's been perhaps heightened public concern about racial justice within our workplaces, within our communities, within our society as a whole. And you don't need me to remind you of one of the critical triggers just over 12 months ago in Minneapolis, where the murder of George Floyd, which triggered that tsunami of really anger about the failure of modern societies and democracies to live up to their values and to demonstrate their commitment to tackling racism and securing racial justice for all. So in that context, the work of the TUC Anti-Racism Task Force was born, but also in a context of what frankly has been a hostile environment for Black workers. And again, you probably don't need me to tell you many of the facts in relation to that hostile environment, in relation to access to employment, the rates of unemployment amongst Black workers. We know that rates to which Black workers have fallen out of employment during the course of the pandemic has exceeded the rates for white workers some 26 times over. That we're seeing Black workers in greater, more insecure employment, and of course in the education sector that might include Black workers who are disproportionately more likely to be employed in schools via agency routes or on temporary and insecure contracts. And we're seeing Black workers facing, more likely to face the possibilities of disciplinary action, fire and rehire practices, and so on. And of course, in schools, no different to wider society, of course. Relatively few Black leaders and principals in our schools and colleges, and a real concern about the extent to which schools and colleges are being proactive in showing leadership in relation to the issues of racial justice at work. We know from evidence that Black teachers are more likely to be denied promotion opportunities, less likely to secure paid progression. That during the course of the pandemic, the real concerns around access to individual risk assessments for Black staff, and actually that hostile environment to some extent being played out within schools and colleges themselves, where Black teachers and Black staff generally report feeling more likely to be threatened with disciplinary procedures if they question or challenge what is being done or how they are being managed on a day-to-day basis. Now, I mean, you know, as a sister trade union, the NSWT is proud to work alongside our other TUC affiliates, including the NAHT, both bilaterally, but also under the wider auspices of the TUC's Anti-Racism Task Force, to address those issues, to address the issues of racism in the workplace, to address the issues of how we can support employers to do the right thing in advancing racial justice at work, how we can create not only structures and systems that enable workplaces and enable employers to demonstrate their competence in relation to anti-racism practice, to root out racist and discriminatory cultures and practices. As has been said, you know, whether that's the practice of so-called banter in the workplace, banter, one person's banter is another person's harassment and victimization and bullying. So how we can create the conditions in which we can support employers to do that is very much a topical concern for the task force. But of course, this is a task force of the trade union movement as well. And this is about unions demonstrating that we can lead by example, that actually we're not just simply preaching to employers out there about how they need to reform their practice, but actually we are demonstrating, both as employers, but also in terms of our day-to-day services and support for our members, that we are committed anti-racists, that we're committed to supporting Black workers in confronting and challenging everyday racism, that we're committed to supporting and to challenging our negotiators to negotiate for racial justice at work. We're committed to supporting and challenging our negotiators in terms of their work with employers to build on good practice that exists out there in the system, and there is good practice out there in the system, and we need to see more of that. And also, you know, to demonstrate that as trade unions, we are safe places for our Black members, so that where Black members do experience racism in the workplace, the first place that they should be turning is to their unions, turning to their unions for that support, for that advice and that counselling, but also for that representation and advocacy to challenge racism in the workplace. So that's very much what the task force is charged to do. Perhaps bold ambitions to seek to transform the world of work for the better, but also perhaps more modest ambitions, and that is about seeking to transform our trade unions to be the place which demonstrates that we are at the vanguard of all the efforts to bring about the change which is so desperately needed and which was so poignantly highlighted just a little over 12 months ago with the resurgence of that Black Lives Matter movement calling for racial justice in the world of work, in our communities and in society at large. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And yeah, couldn't agree more that obviously where people are experiencing discrimination and any kind of difficulties in relation to any protected characteristic, obviously we're talking about race here, but to your union being your first port of call. Thank you very much. So you will also now see that we've been joined by our General Secretary, Paul Whiteman, who's managed to get on, some difficulties there after his meeting finished. Before we move on to some questions, and I'm really pleased to see that we have some questions in the Q&A already, and feel free to vote on them as we go along. I'm going to just hand over to Paul very briefly, because obviously we didn't have an opportunity to hear from him at the beginning, just for a couple of words before we then go on, and we'll hear back from him later on at the end of the session. Thanks, Paul.
Sorry, Natalie, you've taken me rather by surprise. I thought you were taking me at the end. That's a fantastic piece of chairing when we've caused so much difficulty. But I know Tim Bowen, our president, extended some words of welcome earlier on. And for me, one of the issues here is how we make sure, as Patrick was saying, as a movement, that what we say as a trade union movement is the authentic voice of our members that are experiencing these difficulties and these problems. And we have on the call this evening some members of ours that have been working to produce some stories that are the authentic and true voices of their experience in education, which we'll be publishing in a few days' time. And what I just wanted to reflect on now really is that extent of where trade unions perhaps haven't got it right up to now, and we find that colleagues don't want to come through some structures and processes to have their voices heard that seem to be alien to them, and push our colleagues away. And to that extent, I absolutely agree with Patrick. We have to look to ourselves as a movement to find out how we solve those barriers within our own movement, to be able to articulate what we're chasing on behalf of our members, on behalf of workers. So just a couple of words from me that I would have said at the start, just to highlight that. And Natalie, if you'll allow me, if we've got time, perhaps I'll do some words of summing up at the end. But really nice to be with everybody.
Definitely. Of course, we'll hear from you again, Paul. Thank you. Okay, so we have some questions here now. And what I've said is that we'll go to the questions at the top of the list, and then the panelists who feel that they've got something they'd like to respond, if you can just let me know. So this first question comes from Vivienne Marl, and it said there's two parts to it. What training is available for senior leaders in anti-racism and privilege? And what training is there for schools in leading good training for staff on this? Sue, would you like to come in first?
Yes, I was just trying to raise my hand there. It is going to be part of my presentation, but Show Racism the Red Card, we do have a programme where we work with trade union members across all of the trade unions, but also in terms of schools, we have done some training, twilight teacher training with teachers directly. We've also done training, we've been involved in the National Social Head Teachers Continuous Professional Development Programme that's coming around. We're delivering some training at both of the what's the word that you're having some get-togethers in London in September, some conferences in September and October. We're on the agenda there to talk about what we do with teachers. We also have online teacher training. Having said all of that, it's not very formalised, it's very sporadic. It is when teachers approach us, it's when individual regions approach us and ask if we can go in. An exciting piece of work we're doing with universities is we're teaching students at Northumbria University how to be good allies and how to get their voices heard. So the question is a fantastic question. I don't think there's a lot happening structurally, informally, but certainly there's a lot happening on an ad hoc basis. When we are approached, we do a lot of teacher training. And certainly with unconscious bias, I know that I've heard that this government doesn't quite believe in unconscious bias. However, it's so important. And we talk about microaggression and privilege and how to really be aware of that and have that at the forefront of your mind when you're training, when you're working with colleagues, when you're developing policies and processes, when you're going to interviewing and when you're promoting people.
Great, thank you very much. And I can see that Sabrina and Diana, your hands up.
Yes, I do actually offer a structured school development programme as part of Educating for Equality, which is a consultancy that I run. So that is specifically for school leaders, because we do feel that it's a really important part of the role for school leaders to have the opportunity to really think about identity and to think about the leadership aspects really of leading an anti-racist school. So we've got quite a number of schools who are at the end of that. It runs across an academic year, because I think with a lot of these courses, you know, as I'm sure you know, a 1 hour or 2 hour workshop just isn't enough to cover the overwhelming sometimes number of things that need to be covered to really start to just chip away at the edge really of becoming an anti-racist school. It's a long journey, and it isn't a tick box exercise. So that's why what we run runs across an academic year in 6 sessions. So if anybody wants some details about that, I'm happy to put the details in the chat or in the answer to that question.
Brilliant, thank you. Please do put those details in the chat. Thank you, Sabrina. Patrick.
Yeah, no, thanks, Natalie, for that. And I mean, it's an excellent question. And whilst I'm not going to sell the wares of the NSWT, I mean, you know, unions are doing fantastic work, by the way, in training their members. And you know, it's vitally important that work continues and that we look to develop it. But you know, we've also got to put responsibility where it needs to sit, where it needs to reside. And clearly employers have a duty here, but in the context of a predominantly state-funded education service, we've also got to be looking to government. And you know, we've seen over the course of the pandemic the disproportionate impacts, adverse impacts of that health pandemic, but also the economic crisis which has been triggered as a result of that pandemic, the unequal impacts on Black communities. It's vitally important, therefore, that government, that ministers are acting in response to that evidence. We heard from, you know, the Secretary of State, Gavin Williamson, just last week in relation to his commitment to investment in teachers, but I didn't hear in teacher development, I didn't hear anything specifically about investment in teacher development in relation to equalities, addressing issues of bias, discrimination that's impacting on the workforce, disproportionate outcomes in relation to pupils and their experiences within schools. These are areas which actually over the course of the last decade and more have been chipped away at systematically, and which there needs to be a deliberate effort to rebuild. Now, I mean, I hesitate to refer to Gavin Williamson here, but I also hesitate to refer to the report of the government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, because that report in itself has got serious question marks about it. But at the heart of that report was a recognition that there is a need for government to address one of these critical areas of deficiency within the system currently, how we build confidence and competence of those who are leading and managing our school system, whether that's in multi-academy trusts or in local authority maintained schools, and that we have a systematic approach to the development of leadership capacity. Now, that was a government commissioned report. I'm still not clear what the government is intending to do about that. We can't continue with piecemeal approaches when it comes to addressing the issues of racial justice in our education system or in our workplace. We need a systematic response. And again, that's what the Anti-Racism Task Force will be calling for as part of its public policy stream of work, that systematic government-led response to the issues of racial injustice in our workplaces.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Obviously, there's, you know, as we've heard, there's a lack in some areas of education that we need in this important topic, but there's also lots around there which is available for people to seek out. So hopefully, you know, we've had some good suggestions that have come through definitely, and people will be able to pick up on that. And I know that Sue has been adding to some comments in the Q&A regarding a specific query about Show Racism the Red Card, so thank you. I'd now like to move on to the next question. Again, this might have been touched in some of the response to what we've just heard, but if there's anything that anyone wants to add, Helen asks, as a largely white, small primary school, we keenly recognise the importance of ensuring our pupils are prepared for the diverse society they inhabit. How can we enable our teachers to have the skills and knowledge to support this learning to ensure we're not enforcing cultural stereotypes? So perhaps other than specific training, which we've discussed, are there any kind of great tips and suggestions that someone can come through with? Lorna?
I have a similar issue in that I'm in a small Devon village primary school, and another head teacher in Devon is also part of the Leaders for Equality, and we've attended much of Sabrina and Diana's training, which is brilliant. We've been using some of that, some of the Show Racism, the Red Card resources. We have done some just really awareness training for heads in our area, because we had to change it to fit the fact that we are predominantly white in the areas that we teach, and that makes it even more important. But I think one of the really revolutionary things that opened lots of the head teachers' eyes when we shared it with them was it's from 1968, but the Jane Elliott Blue Eyes Brown Eyes film, which is fantastic, A Class Divided. And through that, there is a clip that you can show that's shorter than the hour-long version, but it is fascinating, and I think it shows how very rapidly in an all-white school at that time, obviously during segregation, she was able to share with those children, and then later as adults they reflected upon the impact of understanding how rapidly jibes, name calling affected not only their mental well-being over half a day and over a day, but also the levels of aggression that they showed, defending themselves from these names, which were just blue eyes or brown eyes, but the impact on them over that time, and their academic achievement dropped. And this is all over a day. So I think it just helps, perhaps, to share things like that. And it's even more important in those areas in some ways where we lack diversity, and we need to address it. So it's a really important area.
Thank you. Yeah, really effective. That's very impactful. So thanks for sharing that suggestion, for watching that video there, Lorna. Before we move on to our next speaker, just very quickly, there is another comment that sort of the top question on the list asked about how frequently you would raise awareness for race equality with staff. In Carol's experience, staff can calm things down by listening to all sides, following it up with parents. And then Carol says it explodes the next day. Would anyone like to comment on that before we move on? Okay, thank you. Diana.
Sorry, can I just clarify whether Carol's talking about behaviour, or when you're talking about, for example, anti-racist training and then it explodes the next day in terms of conversations with staff?
Okay, so all I've got is what was submitted in writing. So, I mean, my interpretation, the actual words are, in my experience, staff can calm it by listening to all sides and follow up with parents, or gloss over it, and then it explodes the next day. So to me, I mean, maybe you interpret it differently, but to me, I interpret it as there are behaviour issues around race, and staff maybe need to be trained in dealing with that, but you may interpret that differently. So if you want to respond.
I think we've understood the same interpretation. I mean, ultimately, you would hope the background work has been done with regard to personal reflection and unconscious bias, so that staff are coming from an informed point of view. The difficulty would be where staff don't understand the terminology that's been used, the background of that terminology, the derogatory nature of that terminology, and the history behind certain terminology. Without all of that in context, how can you successfully deal with a situation? I would imagine it's exploding because somewhere in that system there's a lack of understanding either by staff and or pupils. And so you've got a network there that you kind of need to deal with and unpick and unpack with staff, parents and pupils before you deal with it successfully. I don't know so much if that's answered your question, Carol, but I think in those situations, there has to be clear systems of reporting, obviously for the child, if it's the child that's been affected. Equally, Kutia was saying earlier, there has to be clear channels of reporting if it's the staff member. that's been affected. And then there has to follow clear actions. Parents want to know that their child has been listened to, heard and understood, that their child is valued in that educational context, and that ultimately something has been put in place to make it better for the next person, hopefully for it not to happen again, but if it does, that there are clear actions in place to counteract that.
Thank you.
Natalie, can I just add to that a little bit?
Yeah.
I was just listening really keenly then, and at the beginning I talked about what Black working people are experiencing and why there is no trust in systems and there's no trust in procedures. And I think we have to remember that children are not exempt from that, and we need policies that everybody owns, that everybody understands, and that absolutely set the marker down for what our position on being anti-racist organisations is. And what was just being said about what actions are going to be taken so that there is confidence that issues are going to be raised, they're going to be dealt with, and they're going to be satisfactorily dealt with, because I think that's really important. And I think where parents kick off and come in and we've all had that, it's about making sure that those robust systems are in place and that they're communicated well. But I think we shouldn't shy away from having those strong systems in place that everybody owns. And if you're using your governing body, using whatever consultation forums you have, you can make sure that the community is part of that process.
Excellent. Thank you. And yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And that's actually a good opportunity for me to bring in Emma here, talking about governing bodies. And I'm sure Emma will have something to refer to in terms of what we talked about, progression as well, because obviously from the governor's perspective, that's an important thing to consider. So welcome, Emma. Thank you from the NGA.
Thank you very much for including us here. And absolutely, I wanted to touch on sort of the huge role, in fact, that governing boards can have in this area. And it's sort of our job to help them realise that it is their job to do this. So NGA has been on a mission for quite a number of years now to raise the issues of equality, diversity, inclusion generally, but particularly around anti-racism. And that's in part because of the fact that we know governing boards themselves are not well representative in terms of necessarily their communities, if they come from diverse communities, but particularly in terms of volunteers from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And I think that point that was made just now about being in a school where actually you are serving a white population, we've obviously talked about that a lot as well, because the reason to have a diverse governing board is not just about reflecting your community, it's also about role models, and it's about ensuring pupils are ready, to be citizens of the wider world. But I just wanted to start before I talk about our work in terms of governing board behaviours and composition. I just wanted to really acknowledge the incredibly important role that boards should play in terms of setting, alongside their senior leaders, head teachers, of course, the culture of the school, and that being absolutely central to governance. Some of you may know that first core responsibility of governing boards is about setting values, vision and culture, and obviously that's absolutely important to making sure that the school is working well in this area. And I think we could probably talk about that for quite a long time. It's easy for me to say that, isn't it? We all should have healthy cultures in our organisations. It's much more difficult to get there, and several people have already talked about staff being safe to discuss issues, to raise concerns. The whole area of whistleblowing is one I've done some work on, and it's not an easy area. So that's a big issue, how together senior leaders and governing boards set healthy cultures. But I just wanted to start off with that. Several people have also talked about the role as employers. And almost all governing boards now are employers, and even those that aren't, because they're community schools, actually they act in place of the employers, so they should be behaving in the same way as other governing boards. But I'm not going to say very much the time I've got, because there are other people that are very expert on that area. But I just wanted to make sure, because you're quite rightly, delegates are raising the issue about training. One of the things at NGA we try to do is provide training, both more virtually like this, face-to-face when that's possible, but also e-learning. So both our guidance and our e-learning does have training on equality and diversity. But we know that that's really a first step, because it's much more about responsibilities and duties, and it doesn't go as far into behaviours as we want it to. So we're currently thinking about how we can develop more on that, particularly on e-learning, which is very well taken up by governing boards. But if I now sort of move on, because I don't think other people will be covering this, to actually looking at governing boards, sort of, as it were, heal thyself. The data is shocking, and it is shocking. There isn't any absolutely pure national data on this. It's not recorded anywhere, the makeup or ethnicity of governing boards. But from our own annual governance survey, we know about 4 to 5% of those currently serving on governing boards are from Black, Asian or minority ethnic backgrounds, and that clearly is not good enough. But I've got lots of other data behind the scenes. We've written quite a lot on this, but because it's been very obvious to us for a number of years, we have been running a campaign called Everyone on Board. And when I finished, I'll put the link into the chat. In fact, it's its 3rd birthday of its official launch, but I'm not being self-congratulatory here at all, because we are monitoring with the recruitment agencies. There are 3 independent agencies, Inspiring Governance, Governors for Schools, and Academy Ambassadors. So we monitor both the volunteers, but also then which volunteers are matched. And I'm really pleased to say that now, coming forward on those platforms, we have between 25–29% of volunteers are Black, Asian and minority ethnic, which is excellent, but also they're being matched in that same proportions, because we were obviously really worried that people would begin volunteering in greater numbers but not necessarily be accepted onto boards. But even so, the pace of change is slow and frustrating. And I did write a blog last year about we need to make these things happen more speedily. I think a lot of us who've been working in this field feel the same, don't we? That there's acknowledgement now of the issues, but what are we actually going to do? You know, how do we make change? And that's the really hard thing. And I think, you know, at NGA, we know we're in this for the long term. So we were asked last August to do some more work, focus groups looking at the experiences of Black and Asian governors and trustees, and we are publishing that towards the end of this month on the 22nd of June, and many of you here will get invitations to that, but if other people are interested, please do contact us, because what we were talking to our volunteers about was also what are their experiences once they got onto boards, because we've talked about our recruitment of volunteers work as the right people around the table, but that's only really part of the story. Once you are around the table, are you taken seriously? Is your voice heard? Do you feel included? And so we wanted to really tease out those issues. So I hope the report that we're going to publish shortly will really help sort of take that one step further. Somebody also already mentioned this isn't a tick box. It's not, oh, we need one Black governor, tick. This is much more important than that. And again, a bit like you, because yeah, I could keep going, but I will just say as my last point, this is fundamental to good governance, because good governance needs a diversity of voices. So it's incredibly important when we're discussing issues that we have people coming at those issues from lots of different perspectives and background and knowledge and skills. So, you know, this isn't something that we're doing because we're being, you know, good. This is something that we're doing because actually it makes for for better governance. So I'll probably stop there, but hopefully there'll be a few questions that allow me to elaborate a little bit more. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. Looking forward to that report coming out as well. Okay, we're going to move on swiftly to Sue from Show Races in the Red Card. Thank you, Sue.
Okay, thank you. So Show Races in the Red Card, this is actually our 25th year, which I'm quite proud of, because it means that we're not an organisation who's just suddenly come along since the murder of George Floyd. We've been around for a very long time. And I absolutely agree with Sabrina when she said, I think for leadership training and that long-term impact and that long-term change in behaviours, you do need longer-term training. Our role has always been to go into schools and run workshops with children and young people. So we have developed our workshops to, we find a way to talk to children about difference, about race, about worldview, about how opinions are formed. And then we go up and talk about the ladder of hate and how you can very quickly go from having someone playing with your friend next door to the neighbour coming round for a cup of tea till suddenly the army's marching through the streets. And we will talk about Bosnia and the fact, we will talk about the Holocaust, but we also talk about Bosnia because it was in Europe and it only happened in 1992. So with our older young people, they can't quite understand that the Olympic Games were there and you used to go on your holidays there, and yet this happened. And it all comes down to that hate and that fostering the other person. So we talk a lot about respect and about respecting everyone despite religion or colour or ethnicity or language. I mean, obviously we do go into detail of all of those other things as well, but that's our approach, and it's a very good approach, and we have some fantastic light bulb moments in schools. So we work with children from the age of 7 onwards, and all of the workshops are designed right up to sort of school, colleges and universities. So that was the bread and butter of our work. And then George Floyd was tragically murdered last year, and our phone lines and our requests for training absolutely went off the wall. Huge companies like PayPal UK, we're working with 5 NHS partnerships across the country at the moment, real high-level, well-known companies who wanted to look at took a look at themselves and reflected and realised they weren't doing enough. And that reflection is now being reflected in everything that we're hearing this evening. What we didn't get was a groundswell from teachers to do that training, but that was understandable because we were right in the middle of the pandemic, and understandably teachers were dealing with everything else that they needed to deal with. And it was around about that time that we launched our 4-module online teacher training course, which has been referred to in the chat room. It's 4 modules, it's 2 hours per module, and we look at the history, we look at the language, we look at immigration, we look at the story of slavery, the Equality Act. So it informs teachers with that background knowledge and information, and it builds on it. So it scaffolds to a point where they feel, and they can dip in and out, where they feel more confident. What we always get told by teachers is, I don't know how to respond. If child A says this to child B, I don't know what to say and what to do. So when we do our teacher training, we do some modelling. We demonstrate how we work with children and young people. And then, so we give the teachers the tools to do that as well. And then we observe them, model in the lessons, and, help them to tweak it. We're also always available for any advice and support. It's obviously, we're a charity, we like to charge for our service, and we do need to make money to keep going, but we always offer anybody who does our training, just send us an email, come back to us, anything that you want to know about, anything that you're not sure about, we can do that as well. We work with SEND schools, we work with little ones, and we just talk about we use a something else narrative where it's a bit like the brown eyes and the blue eyes. I remember learning about X and O, and about X being different, and all the O's gather together to exclude the X, and how did that feel? So it's in groups and out groups. And I really liked, Diana, you used unpick and unpack. Exactly, yeah, what happened? How did it happen? Why did it happen? And how can we change it? What can we do differently? We're really delighted, nobody's mentioned it this evening, but the Welsh Government now have this on the Welsh curriculum in schools to talk about colonialism and the history of slavery. And where we've got a campaign at the moment, we've written to Gavin Williamson, we're trying to get unions on board and get schools on board to try and strengthen that campaign, to say we think that should be taught on the English curriculum too. So I don't know whether that will happen. In terms of zero tolerance, I often talk to teachers, you know, if you think about child protection and safeguarding many years ago, teachers, it's not my job to do that. And there's been a huge shift in attitude and behaviours. No teacher now would ever ignore a child who came in with a bruise, or go away and have a think about it and then maybe wonder what they should do about it. And that's because of the training, and that's because you have a named child protection teacher, and it's something, it's putting in those kind of structures in the schools that I think would enable you to move forward, to have, you know, zero tolerance. I love that, it's fantastic. In terms of our adult training, again, we have a range of workshops, we have a range of teacher training, but we also run an 8-week-long program as well. And lots of schools will choose teaching ambassadors. Especially if it's a big school, they'll have an ambassador in their school who is that named person to go to. They might be called champions, they might be called ambassadors. Different people who provide training will call them different things. So I don't think I'm going to talk for too much longer. Just to say that with the pandemic, we developed a lot of online workshops. We never did online. We always did face-to-face, but we developed gaming workshops, you know, abuse for gaming young people, what that's like, it's terrible, abuse through social media. So it's really helped us to expand on what we do, and we're reaching out to a lot more people, a lot more trade unions and a lot more schools. So if anybody wants to know anything, I have put my email address in the Q&A. Please just email, ask me anything you want, and I'll try and help. Just one last thing to say about the online training. It's CPD accredited, which is fantastic. So in terms of your own continuous professional development, it has been recognised by an awarding body, and you can get that as part of your work.
Thank you very much, Sue.
Finished, okay.
Sorry, thank you.
Sorry.
And I know obviously at the NAHT you've been working closely with NAHT as well, and there'll be some more of that coming, particularly to officials as well in the near future. So I want to now move away from the question of training. There's so much that we could keep covering about that, and even I thought an hour and a half would it's just been filled so much so quickly and easily. But there's a question on here from let me see who it's from. Sorry, I've lost it now. Gone back onto from Sarah Fisher. And Sarah asks if there's any help to support schools in writing a strategy for achieving a target of Black, Asian and minority ethnic representation in their staff. How can I positively encourage Black, Asian and minority ethnic applicants? I wonder if anyone would like to come forward and give some advice on that point. Kutya.
I mean, I think you have to look at your adverts and your application process as well. We've been recently doing some work on things like nameless application processes, application forms that don't then include details that would unconsciously bias against people in terms of their former education, in terms of their salaries, etc. And obviously you would have to do that within a safeguarding context. But what I would say is there is a real merit to partnering with other organisations in the local area, other schools, other networks, and looking at what they're doing, looking at pools of applications that exist, seeing what's successful, and also with universities. We are in the process of just putting out under the Anti-Racism Task Force some guidance around this and working on this area.
Great, thank you very much. I can't see anyone wanting to add to that, so I'm going to move on to the next question, and this is from Sandy Tomlinson. It says, how do we get employers to understand that this is not about making it right for Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff or students, but it's about equality for all? I'm hearing people talking about what we need to do for Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff or students as if we're asking for special treatment. This has to be about changing mindsets and behaviours, and to be honest, basic humanity. I think, does anyone want to comment on that point at all? Lorna?
Yeah, I think it's they are all part of the same issues. Obviously, there are historical aspects to do with slavery and so on that underpin quite a lot of racist issues, but in reality, it's around people's unconscious bias. It is about, or implicit bias, about stereotyping. It's about the narrative that we have in our media and that we get from our leadership, actually, from the government. Those the way that it's woven into the structure of our culture and our society that we need to address. And I agree, it's not about special treatment, it's actually about fair treatment for everyone. And it's about educating ourselves and everyone else that there should be no place for hate based upon groups of whatever variety. And that's why it's so disappointing, actually, to hear yet again from Tony Sewell's group and from our government that they are discounting training in unconscious bias. I think it's incredibly important to understand what underpins it, what sort of psychological things underpin it, as well as sociological.
Thanks, Lorna. Patrick, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, Natalie, I'd like to support what Lorna was just saying, and also pick up something that Emma was also referring to. You know, in a sense, what matters is what's measured, and in one sense, unless we look for the data in relation to how race operates within the workplace, just as with regard to gender or disability, for example. If we don't look for that, we don't actually observe what's going wrong and where it's going wrong, and have appropriate strategies in place to be able to put things right. So yeah, I absolutely understand the thrust of the question, which is, you know, surely this is about everybody's well-being and inclusion in society. And of course it is, but we have to be very explicit and deliberate in our actions in order to understand how race, whether that's in the form of unconscious bias, if that's the language to be used, or it's a more deliberate form of bias and exclusion, how and where that operates, to locate it and to thereby begin to address it. But, you know, one of the issues in that report of the Commission on race and ethnic disparities was all about taking race off the table, saying that actually we don't need to look for the issues of race, we need to look at other issues. Well, we do need to look at the other issues as well. We do need to look at the issues of social class. We need to look at the issues of geography, at the experiences of workers as well as young people in urban versus rural areas. We do need to look at all of that. We need to look at the intersection of gender, of disability, of age, of sexual orientation. But we also need to look at the intersection of race. And, you know, one of the things about the task force has really been grappling with is this issue of the intersection between race and socioeconomic group or social class. Because, you know, many of the experiences that we've seen in relation to Black workers, particularly during the period of the pandemic, we can link to insecurity of employment, we can link to low wage employment with little by way of social protection in relation to sickness absence, which leaves workers exposed to greater harm and vulnerability in the workplace and potentially transmission of COVID. We can link it to working in precarious employment, where workers are feel less able to ask their managers or their bosses for time off, for example, to get a COVID jab. And you know, we can look at all of that and more besides, and begin to see that actually this is about race, it's about class, it's about all of us. If we want to create better workplaces, fairer workplaces, inclusive workplaces, then it's got to be better, fairer and more inclusive for everyone. And that means that we need to understand the experiences of everyone at work.
Natalie, I think you were on mute then, but were you calling me in? Okay, so just to agree with Patrick, really, I think your question goes to the central point, and the way I'd express it is how we begin to understand what progress we're making, and we've measured progress really against statistics as much as anything else, rather than real progress and real change in attitude. So employers look at what are their ratios like and tick a box because their ratios are correct, or we look at compliance with legislation. All too often we define racial justice and equality through the eyes of the law that's written rather than real change. And I think that's the thing that has to move on most out of this conversation that we're having now. We can't simply keep going back to box ticking or window dressing exercises to reassure ourselves that our hearts are in the right place and we've done something. We have to do so much more than that. And there's a question in there which I won't answer now, but it talks about how do we maintain the momentum and why has it taken a tragic death to take us forward on that. And that's something I want to address in my summing up actually, because I think that is also important to what we're trying to achieve now. So just to agree with the earlier contributors and put it just in a slightly different way, I guess. Thank you very much. I noticed, Sabrina and Diana, that your hand's up, but I would, if it's okay with you, if you don't mind, because I think we might run out of time very quickly. If I can just ask you if you've just got a point that you're able to make very quickly before we move on to the next section.
That's fine, I can save it for later.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Yes, so we are now moving into, we have had quite a few questions that have come through. Some of them have been, I think, covered. There's a lot around training, and some of them have been covered in various ways already. So feel free, if you want to look through the questions, if you've got anything you want to share with others, to add on to the comments and answer the questions as well at that point. Some of them are around data, and as I say, unfortunately at the moment we haven't got time to answer everything on this webinar. If there is something which we can take away as part of our ongoing work with this, then we will share that with people afterwards. So what I'd like to now do, with moving on from the questions, I'd like to introduce again, we have three authors with us, as I've said, Sabrina, Diana and Lorna. You're all members of our network Leaders for Race Equality, which was established last June. And what I'd like to do before we hear from all of you, and I'll also hear from some of your stories that you've shared in the book that Paul's mentioned already, is just go to you, Lorna, because you're the person who actually came up with the idea of this book. And I'd like to, if you could share with people, I'd like to hear what it was that made you, what gave you the idea.
Thanks, Natalie. Well, it came out of all the stories that members of the group had shared, and they shared them in the very first meeting of the Leaders for Race Equality group. And I wasn't there for that. I only later on, I joined sort of the end of July perhaps. But in that first meeting, it was so powerful that then once I joined, other people started to share their stories, and they chimed with lots of things that I'd experienced, and I just suggested that we had we should be putting this out there to share with other people, because those are the real experiences of people coming through school, at university, and when you're going for jobs. And we have members of the group who've been going for jobs as well, and promotion, and lots of successes to celebrate, but also the barriers that people have had. I happen to live next door to somebody who actually makes books, so that made it easier for me to find out if it was possible. And then thankfully Natalie took the idea seriously and took it to Paul, and Paul was really generous and positive about it. So yeah, it's been a really good process, but it came out of everybody's stories and experiences, and how cathartic it was for people to be able to share that and realize that, as the book is called, you're not alone. So it was really about sharing that and encouraging others who might want to come into leadership in schools.
Brilliant, thank you. And actually, you've touched on when you used it about how cathartic it was. I wanted to ask all of you how you felt when you actually were sharing your stories, when you were getting them down in writing.
Well, for me, it was a little bit out of my comfort zone, if I'm completely honest, because it was things that I've never really shared in its entirety to anybody. So it felt a little bit like really personal, actually. And I think not having read anybody else's until I got a copy to read just last week was really quite difficult, because I wasn't sure whether what I had written was going to be, was it going to stand out? Was it going to be similar to what others had written? So for me, it was a really, really personal experience.
Well, I think for some of us, we probably still have the element of two things as leaders. One, are we in it alone? Is it just happening to us? And then you've got the other side, which is the imposter syndrome. So no matter where you are in your career, in your leadership, whether you've made it to headship yet or not, there's that side that kind of plays on you of, am I qualified enough? Do I have the right skills, knowledge and understanding? Am I an expert in my field, for example? Am I well spoken enough? And all of those things play out. And when I was writing my account, and I sort of thought back to, you know, my early years, sort of mid-years and so on, to write an account through the lens of race from my life was hard. It was difficult to face that for me. And that's not to say that I've been through brutal racist experiences. No, I haven't. But I live every day as a brown person. I cannot live a day without being a brown person, without a brown lens. I don't have the kind of luxury, if you like, of a certain privilege that's afforded to an ethnic minority, if you like. I have to live my life through the lens that I've got, with the family that I've got, and so on and so forth. So putting that down on paper was deeply personal. And then to have it out in print, yes, you want to share it with the world if you like, but then there's also that kind of caveat that you're opening up your world and your mind and your soul really to people and potentially to criticism.
Just to ask you both though, because none of us in the group have actually met physically yet, have we? Although we've talked all the time, but did you notice similarities? Because I really did notice so many.
It was such a sense of relief for me reading everybody else's and the title. I think I shed a tear, to be honest, because I read the title and thought, well, I really am. I'm not alone. And everybody who'd written a chapter had. We hadn't all had the same experiences, but there were such stark similarities between the experiences that we had, and it just made me feel so much better about having contributed and kind of exposed, as you said, myself to possible criticism, which is not something I would normally do.
And I think one of the positives of having the Leaders for Race Equality group under the NAHT is that deep and true sense of belonging. Because I think without that, yes, you belong to the union, yes, you belong to different groups, even in your staffing structure or the workplace where you do work, that added layer of having a group where you belong with like-minded others, people of colour, there's almost like a shared understanding that's unsaid and unspoken until we've now shared it and spoken about it, that you all are kind of linked in with, if you like. And so when you share something on a level of belonging, there's nothing deeper and greater than that you as a person feel somewhere that you belong and you are placed.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've been working with the network since it started and seeing the relationships that have built up and the support that people have got from being part of that, and it's really been fantastic to see. Lorna, how did you feel sharing your story?
I think just like everybody else, I mean, I left quite a lot out of mine because some of it I did feel was kind of too raw, and I think it's amazing actually. Before this stage, before joining this group, I think I've never really been a groups person. I've always for lots of reasons, but largely because of that idea of being excluded and feeling excluded and not recognizing or being recognized by groups. So I think it was a big risk. I think it was brilliant that the union were prepared to back us on that. But I just felt, from having heard just snippets of what people had to share, that it chimed with so much that I'd experienced. And, you know, we've all wanted to write a book at some stage. So to be able to write it with people who I've got, you know, so much in common with and I admire so much, I felt incredibly proud of everything that everybody had contributed. And I do think it's so brave to put that out there of all of us, because we're in this position, you know, as leaders of schools. So the other side of it is that we had to, I suppose, have both our personal head on and then our professional head on to a certain extent. And so, yes, like the rest of our lives, a balancing act. But I think everybody did such a brilliant job in their stories.
But before we can hear from some of the book from you three of you, just to explain a little bit more about it. So the book You Are Not Alone includes stories from 14 authors from the Leaders for Race Equality Network, and it's going to be shared with all NAHT members. We will be launching it towards the end of this month. We'll be looking at plans, developing plans, perhaps more widely, hopefully more widely at some point in the future, but that's something we can share at a later date if things develop. But that's the plans for now. So I know I've asked you, and I realise it's so personal, but if you're happy to share some of your some extracts from your stories that you've contributed to the book, I'm sure that the people here would be very much looking forward to hearing them. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I don't mind. I don't mind starting, but I don't mind if anybody else is really keen. So I'm reading a bit from the start, middle and end, because I didn't want to read too much, and they sort of linked. So I'll just begin. And Sarah, I will try to pause every now and again. Oh, I don't think if you'd asked me back in early childhood that I'd have been able to tell you what colour I was, or anyone else for that matter. Until I was about 8 years old, I don't think I'd have understood the question. Then we moved house, and an imposed identity I had been almost unaware of, race, became all pervasive and coloured my days from then on. I left my happy, diverse, big town school in Northampton to attend a small village local primary school in Oxfordshire. As a child, when we went to any village event, my biggest fear was that this a small but significant group from my school might call out the horrible names that they used in front of my mum. I felt I might catch fire and die of shame if she heard, but I never for a second considered telling anyone. Now, as head teacher of a small village primary school, I have the opportunity to protect children, to prevent them from experiencing or participating in discrimination, to encourage our pupils to see the person before everything else. So as I say, those are just three little bits from my story. My mum is Jamaican, and she came over sort of mid-1960s to complete her training as a nurse, and she hated everything about here initially. Then she met my dad, so she stayed. And my dad is English, white English, and they are still together and very strong partnership and very, very important in my life. But the way that my mum was treated and also the conflicts within my own school career, I think really give you that perspective. It's actually almost like a superpower, because you really empathize with other people when they're going through difficulty, and you can really pick up on those things. So yeah, it's been really interesting to reflect on it through the book, and I've really enjoyed the process. Actually, it's been amazing. So thank you.
Thank you. Before I move on to Sabrina or Diana, just very, very quickly, Lorna, what would you like to see happening as a result of this book coming out?
I think, as another member of the group, Rue, said, it's about not only for those coming after us who are black or brown, or who feel different, and therefore might feel that they don't necessarily fit their idea or image of what a head teacher is, or a governor's idea or image of what a head teacher is, that perhaps they will be able to see that variety. They will see there are many ways of getting to, to help other people through being a school leader. But also, I think it's for people who have not necessarily got that perspective, who may not have any diversity in their background, and may need to consider and reflect on things that they may have done. Because one of the things that often crops up is that persistent idea of, where do you come from? And when you've answered Northampton and they're still not satisfied, you suddenly realize, oh, you mean something else. But being born here, you just don't, it's that sort of thing that makes you suddenly feel a bit alienated. So I suppose it's just that possibility of people walking in other people's shoes and reflecting on how that feels.
Brilliant, thank you. Sabrina, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'll go next. Again, I've got just a few extracts from my chapter. From an early age, I always had a deep sense of justice, even if I wasn't yet able to articulate it. Back in London, living in Tottenham, I was surrounded by diversity. Nevertheless, in many of the activities I took part in, such as dance lessons, I was one of the only children with darker skin. And at the time, through media, books and magazines, we generally only saw people with pale skin and straight hair being lauded as beauty icons. I remember my third-year junior teacher, Mr. Tharp, being the first and last teacher I ever had to teach us something positive about being black. While clearing out the loft recently, I happened upon all the university's essays I wrote for my undergraduate psychology degree. I came across two in particular, one on the need to decolonise the national curriculum and the other on embedding anti-racism in education. Reading these essays reminded me of my original motivation for becoming a teacher. I wanted to be like Mr. Tharp, to be that inspirational teacher who switches something on in a child, helps them to see who they are, where they've come from, and who they could become. I had such a wonderful vision for the educator I would be back then. While reading those essays I wrote back in 1998 and 99, I wondered where that person went. I have had many successful years of being a teacher, and I hope that I've been that memorable teacher for at least a few children along the way. But I have recently been reflecting on why it has taken becoming a head teacher for me to fully realise that vision of being an active anti-racist in the workplace. Why was I not brave enough to challenge and transform the curriculum I taught previously to ensure that the colonial outlook so deeply embedded in our education system was eradicated? I worked it out. Conformity. I have had to dim my light in most of the schools I worked in, neutralise my blackness so as to not make others feel threatened or intimidated, not rock the boat, not be accused of playing the race card. I was afraid that by pointing out injustice, that I would be the one accused of racism. When I started my headship after my first grueling year, my school improvement advisor told me not to underestimate the impact of the fact that I was young, black, and a woman, and that some people just wouldn't like it. And I'm now going into my 5th year of headship. I've recruited and trained a strong team. I no longer feel like I have to make myself more palatable by not discussing my blackness, even though I know that the lightness of my skin and the curl pattern of my hair have made me easier to accept in many of my previous roles. I feel like I'm finally able to be that educator I aimed to be when I wrote those essays over 20 years ago. But what saddens me is that even after 20 years, the issues I discussed in my essays haven't really changed at all. Just a little snippet.
Thank you very much. And yeah, very, very important point you just made at the end there as well about the issues not changing. For you, Sabrina, what would you like to see happening as a result of this book?
I think just anybody that reads it really to depend, you know, regardless of their own background, to either have a better understanding of what some of their staff might be bringing to the table when they come to work in their schools, and for people who have had similar experiences to literally know, as the title of the book said, that you are not alone, and lots of people have had similar experiences, and just knowing that is powerful in itself, and just makes you feel like you're part, you know, you belong to a group really, and that the fact that we can share our experiences brings us together, because I really do believe that we're all, you know, everybody in the world is linked in some way, and I think it's important that we get that sense of connectedness between us.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's lots of positive comments as well in the chat about hearing those stories and people who are saying that, you know, knowing that you're not alone is so important. Diana.
Again, I've just got snippets as I go through. Primary school was where I first experienced race. From the outset, I could see the disparity. High school was met with a mixture of friends from different backgrounds, and often lonely and hard to navigate time in terms of fitting in and having that sense of belonging. What I did realise in these years was that I had an inherent and deep-rooted sense of justice and equality. I relished my learning. The empowerment and veneration of Black and Indian leaders gave me hope for a better, more equal world, one where I could fit in, and also one where I could advocate for justice. My innate will for equality was ignited. I felt it then, and I still feel it now. I have made my closest friends as an adult, yet none of them resemble my own background. We are a flavoursome array of heritages, beliefs, and traditions, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Have you ever wondered if you fit the bill? Are you the right, acceptable colour? Do you speak acceptably well? I'm a light shade of brown, olive skin, some might say. I speak well, pronouncing my T's and F's correctly. I'm an acceptable shade, it would seem. But I know colleagues who have not been afforded the same recognition. Nothing is ever said, of course, but best fit often wins the day after interview. Currently, I am on the path to headship. I was left with the question as to whether I want a head of school post or a head teacher post. I know now that I firmly want the latter. I want to be part of the next generation of leaders, leaders who have equality on the agenda, leaders who see everyone and are bold enough to make changes. I want to be that change. I want to make a difference. I want to leave a small part of the world better than I found it.
Thank you for sharing that, Diana, as well. I'd like to ask you then as well, obviously, what you would see as something you'd like to happen as a result of this book coming out.
I think I'd want there to be wider recognition that actually every single person has a voice, and you don't need permission to use it. You are you, and who you are and what you bring to the table is valid. And it's not more valid or less valid than anybody else, but each of us has a voice. And I would say to you, use it.
Brilliant, thank you. It's so interesting to hear. So I think it'd be interesting to hear you actually reading your stories aloud. Having read the book myself, I know that we've had people saying they're very much looking forward to being able to read that, and hopefully we'll be able to share that more widely at some point in the future as well. You know, looking forward to seeing where that takes you all. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you all of our panelists for joining us today. Before we leave, I'm going to hand back over to Paul Whiteman. Yeah, over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much everybody for attending an NAHT event. I want to start really just with the second half of a question that Sandy Tomlinson asked earlier on that we haven't got to. And the second half of the question says she really needs to understand why it took the aftermath of the death of George Floyd to bring about so many groups and movements together to deal with the racial issues. Now, for me, that's a question that doesn't have a satisfactory answer, frankly. Groups like trade unions and other groups have been working at these issues unsuccessfully for some time. And I sense the depth of frustration in the questions and in the debate. Will we really move on? Will we really grab this moment? Well, all I can say is we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd. And that's a seminal moment, I think. This isn't something that was abstract. The world saw this, and that's why it's taken off in the way that it has. And I know as a campaigner, as a trade union official, there are moments in time, there are events that you have to grab with both hands and say, let's make as much progress as we can so that those tragedies aren't wasted. And when that happened, I fell into the normal trap with a lot of other trade union leaders and others to talk about the next commission that we might run. What statement do we put on our website to show support? How many other guaranteed spaces do we have for members to attend committees? And frankly, we've been doing that for years. And the one thing that I know is if you trust members to come up with the answers, if you trust members to express their voices, then actually we can make some progress. So when the Leaders for Race Equality group was conceived, that was really conceived at a point of view of saying, let's talk to our members and let's ask our members what we can do as a union to make progress. And those members picked up the baton and ran with it. And my sincere and genuine thanks to Diana, Sabrina and Lorna and the other members of the Leaders for Race Equality group for picking up that baton, but not just picking up and having the conversation internally, but being willing to share your stories and to illuminate the things that are going on. Because if I know anything, Patrick and I can talk about statistics in the depths of Whitehall, and we can argue about statistics and comparisons and everything else. And that might be entertaining for some, but it's the stories of individuals that bring to light injustice and the real effect on individuals that will change minds and will change hearts. And that's how together we build those partnerships, we build allies between ourselves, and together we can take this forward, because actually this is an issue for us all. The thing that the tragic death of George Floyd reminded me is this isn't an issue for certain parts of the NHT membership, it's an issue for the whole of the NHT membership, and that's something that we haven't been good enough at, and that's a challenge to us as a union that we really have to respond to and overcome. And I hope that together, alongside the TUC and our sister affiliates in the TUC and the work that's being pulled together there, all unions and the whole union movement will respond in kind. So thank you very much for coming today and listening. We will make mistakes along the way. We will cause frustrations along the way. But if we work together, I'm sure we can make real progress. So enough from me for now.
Thank you very much. Again, I will reiterate thanks to all of the panelists who joined us from outside the NHT and inside the NHT and the members of Leaders for Race Equality this evening. And thank you to all of you who've joined us to join in with the webinar as well, members and non-members. If you are a member, the link to the Leaders for Race Equality Network has been put into the chat. Please feel free to get in touch if you're interested in joining yourself. And also so it's open to all members from with Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And also, if you aren't a member of NAHT and you are interested in joining, there is a link to our joining page as well in the chat there. So thank you again, all of you. I'm hoping that you'll take away from this, some great ideas for moving forward and how we can work together to improve race equality. Good evening.